So our first speaker is going to be Kathy Kuletz. Dr. Kuletz recently retired from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, but she's still very actively engaged and probably will be for quite some time in both national and international collaborations looking at seabirds in Alaska and worldwide. She received her master's from the University of California, Irvine, and a PhD from the University of Victoria in British Columbia. Throughout her career, she's been involved in quite a few different committees and councils. She served on the Science and Statistical Committee for the North Pacific Fishery Management Council. She was on the Executive Council of the Pacific Seabird Group, the Circumpolar Seabird Expert Network, the Arctic Council. She served on Pisces working groups, on damage assessment and spill response teams, and international conservation committees. And so her talk today is entitled A Seabird's View of the Past, the Present, and the Future of Alaska's Oceans. And so she'll be talking about some of the trends across time and throughout her career for seabirds in Alaska. Talking a little bit about some of the approaches that are applied to understand seabirds, and then looking at how we can learn from seabirds and some of their interactions and responses about the marine environment more generally. And so she notes that Alaska's marine ecosystems are connected, and seabirds move within, among, and beyond these oceans, and therefore are in a really good position to inform us about both ecosystem stability, transformation, and adaptation. So, Kathy.
Thank you. I like that they used a picture from 1978. For me, no one will recognize me, I'm afraid, but at any rate, thanks for the introduction, Matt, and thanks to Lynn and everyone else for having me here today. I do want to acknowledge first that I guess I should say in the Native tradition, my name is Kathy Kuletz. I've lived in Anchorage or in Alaska for almost 50 years, but grew up in the Mojave Desert of California but born in New Jersey, and my parents came to that state via Poland and Ireland. So today I'm glad to be here, and I also want to acknowledge all the people that have been involved in these studies. I'm really presenting the work of many here today, and I'm sure I won't be able to cover everything. When I solicited people for information and slides, it was overwhelming. I came up with over 100 pieces of information I had to distill down. So I certainly could speak all day here with all that, but I won't. And I also want to acknowledge, of course, the people who have been stewards of this land and ocean where we live and work, and all of our funders and partners in all these projects over the many years. So Matt already mentioned why I like to talk about seabirds. They move between the land and the ocean. They depend on the ocean, but they also depend on land to raise their chicks. So they connect these two parts of our environment. They're highly mobile, so they can travel among different ecosystems, and they do, seasonally and sometimes even daily. And in Alaska, they're incredibly diverse and abundant, one of the world's richest avifauna. And so we're really lucky here in Alaska. Well, of course, that was recognized by people in the First Nations. They observed birds. They knew where they went. They wanted to know where they went and why and how they were doing. And also the early explorers started showing up around the 1800s. And they often brought with them naturalists and artists, like these two sketches here. That there's one excellent artist called Frederick von Kuletz. You might recognize that name. Some of these images that he did were based on native descriptions as well. And I'm sure, like many of the explorers, he took some of the native descriptions of these different species that had never been observed by Westerners before, and he wrote them up and drew them and then renamed them after himself. So all observers have similar questions about seabirds, where they go, when do they lay their eggs and raise their chicks, and what different areas different birds use, what they eat, how they're doing year to year. and long-term changes in their populations, and how do they respond to environmental change? Because of course, there's always been environmental change, but just perhaps not as rapidly as we see today. So they're part of an ecosystem, and if you take the big picture, like this one from the Northern Gulf of Alaska Long-Term Ecosystem Research Project, they look pretty small. Those blue circles in the middle there represent the 4 species of seabirds that are included in this, and they look pretty minor. But I disagree with that. For one thing, there's 4 species out of about 60 that we have here. And they're good indicators because they rely on this entire web in one way or another. So I want to look at how seabirds fit in and what role do they play beyond just being consumers. Another way to look at it is a simpler model, a depiction of an Arctic ecosystem. And you might note that seabirds are the only one that actually use air, water, and land among all these depicted here. That's another reason why they're superior study subjects. But they do have their problems in studying them. They're visual, so they're easy to see on land and at sea, but they also have, they're not that easy to study. There are issues. For one thing, they sometimes nest at really incredibly inaccessible sites. They disappear for months at a time, sometimes years at a time, over vast ocean expanses. And they may only visit nests at night, or they only, or they retreat underground when they go to their nests, and so it's hard to find and count them. Nonetheless, we have, as I mentioned, a huge number of seabirds here in our area. We have somewhere between around 30 million seabirds that breed in Alaska, and another 30 million that come up here just to forage in the rich waters of the North Pacific. So seabirds are indicators by many means. You can look at the chronology, gives you an idea of the timing of prey availability, chick growth and success, adult survival over winter, and what stressors they might be facing. Diets, of course, give you an idea of prey distribution and types. They've already been linked directly to predict certain types of groundfish in the Aleutians in the Bering Sea, and salmon and rockfish all the way down the West Coast. But at any rate, why wouldn't you want to study something that looks like this, regardless? We don't have the great aukletis anymore, but we do have whiskered auklets and others, close relatives. So a lot of my work started actually via George Hunt. You may have heard of, put me on a boat back in the 70s during the OXEP years. I had 3 weeks on the Bering Sea when I was seasick most of the time and swore I would never do this again. So, but there were quite a lot of good baseline data collected. Not a lot of it was digitized right away. It took decades before we got our act together on that. But one of the first and easiest methods is counting birds at sea. That's how I started. It's still used today, but it's changed from pencil and paper, where you jotted down that long, from something called a Loran every 10 minutes. And then we now have a D-log and C-log, which we can connect to a GPS computer linked to the ship's records. So also, we've been trying to standardize protocol. That's harder than it sounds because everyone has different goals and different types of vessels that they work from. But in the end, it's all processed to birds per kilometer square. And that's put now into, it has a home in the North Pacific Pelagic Seabird database, which I'll be talking about. The database, of course, depends on a wide range of collaborators. Many of you here have been part of that. And that includes small boat surveys, such as Fish and Wildlife Service does in Prince William Sound, to the NOAA research vessels and other NSF-funded research vessels. And they increasingly rely on the collaboration with ecosystem studies, such as some of these listed here, the Arctic Ice Surveys, ASGARD, AMBON, Distributed Biological Observatory, the LTER, and NOAA ships. And from these, we can get things like species richness and diversity at sea, their abundance and distribution, community structure of seabirds, and the influence of environmental and prey conditions. And we're able to more and more utilize the tools that these larger ships can use, such as collecting data on physical oceanography and plankton, benthos, pelagic trawls, and acoustics. All of these are now wrapped into much of the seabird work we do. We also have been working more on integrating remote sensing data. This includes like sea surface temperature and chlorophyll, such as done with LTER. This is an example from Dan Cushing's work as part of that project on Seabirds. He's the Seabird lead right now. And what this graphic shows in the middle is if you go from the top of each of those panels, that's the inshore areas all the way out to the offshore over time. And the nice thing about the LTER is it's based around the Seward line, which goes back to 70s. But what Dan's found was that the alcids and gulls over time have moved inshore, and in some cases decreases depending on the species. Whereas the tube noses, that's like the albatrosses and shearwaters and fulmars, have increased, especially in the mid and outer domains. So things are going on in these environments that are affecting these changes in community, and that's part of what he's looking at. What is changing are sometimes the prey, and these are some of the key prey that seabirds use in Alaska, not the only ones, but big ones are sand lance, capelin, pollock, and the Arctic we have Arctic cod, and of course the euphausids and copepods that the plankton feeders feed on. And the other thing to keep in mind is that these fish vary energetically and their nutrient value to seabirds. That's important. And they also vary geographically. The same species in the Bering Sea might be richer up in the Chukchi Sea. And that might be why we're seeing some of these birds move up to the Chukchi at different times. So as I mentioned, there's changes in community. In this one study we looked at using at-sea surveys, we identified 5 different clusters of birds, and we named them after the key species in each of those clusters. The one on the left is the decade of 2007 to 2016. And you can see where those different clusters are related to the geographic areas, different marine areas. And then we looked at the heat wave years, 2017 to 2019. And in fact, several of these clusters shrunk and they contracted. Crested auklet cluster, the thick-billed murre, and the least auklet, but 2 of them expanded. One was the shearwater, which seems to move north, and then what we call the low-density community. The seabird density was so low that you really couldn't, you almost didn't see any birds, and that appears to be moving from the coastal areas further west, and there's some evidence that other birds are in fact moving west. If we take just one of those species, the shearwater, short-tailed shearwater, which doesn't breed in Alaska, it comes up from Australia, this map here and it shows you in the blue where birds have decreased during those 3 warm years, 2017 to 2019, and the red show where they've gone up into the Chukchi. However, if you look at the data in a different way, a long-term analysis using a GAM analysis, they actually started shifting northward starting around 2014. And that fits in with work done by Adrian Gall and others, where she actually showed a shift in the offshore community of birds in the Chukchi from mainly fish-eating birds, which do breed in the Chukchi, to plankton-eating birds, which don't breed in the Chukchi, but they move in there after the breeding season. So we've been able to put all this information together with some of our fisheries colleagues and plankton colleagues to propose a working conceptual model. We're not saying this is the way things work as the water is seed up, but it's a framework that we can work from to ask further questions. And it basically shows how the cold pool disappearance as the ice disappears in the Bering Sea affects the movement of fish into the Chukchi Sea. It also affects the movement of copepods and the type of copepods that are available for birds to feed on. It allowed an enormous mass of walleye pollock juveniles into the Chukchi, which may have provided some food, but it's a low quality food. And at the same time, a valuable food like the Arctic cod was pushed further north and affected some of these other birds. So I've talked a lot about at-sea changes. Of course, there's changes that happen at the colony are just as important. And the Alaska Maritime National Wildlife Refuge and others have been critical in monitoring colonies. This just shows the North Bering Sea and Chukchi colonies. But overall, across the state, there's about 1,200 colonies. Obviously, they can't follow them all, so they choose some that they can follow to get trends data on. And these are some of the key ones shown there, circled. And they distill a lot of information from the 10 to 20 colonies that they monitor in a rotating basis over time. And they give us this handy report card, but you can find more detailed data in their annual reports. But this is I find it a very valuable way to look at the happy eggs and sad eggs to determine how things are going for different species in different areas. And now NOAA and their biologists have helped distill this information into as part of the NOAA ecosystem status report. So it's now a true indicator for the fisheries management in Alaska. So besides colonies, there are birds that don't nest in colonies, and they present another problem. One of those is the self-named Kuletz's murrelet. They're small birds, but now we have satellite tags that are small enough we can put them on these little diving birds. And John Pyatt and many of his colleagues have done that, tagging birds in Prince William Sound and in Icy Bay and in Akka. And that the different colors shown on the map there are where those birds go to. And in fact, instead of going south or hanging out in the Gulf of Alaska, they go all the way up into the Bering Sea and eventually up into the Chukchi, many of them. It's quite a journey. And this is post-breeding. So they're up there during the late summer and fall. And that matches pretty well with what we see from the at-sea surveys as well. So we're able to put together the at-sea and the tagging data to provide a full picture of what's going on with these birds. And then there's the work of George Zavoki, who has tagged black guillemots up at the island in Cooper Island near Upyavik. And these birds remain up in the Arctic. They stay real close to the ice edge all through the winter. These maps up here go from October through April. And these birds just track the ice edge. And so obviously they're very dependent on food associated with the ice edge. We can also take these small tags, and they've been used to look at relatively short-term activities, around the nesting period. In this case, black-legged kittiwakes tagged at the Middleton Island. This is part of the Institute for Seabird Research and Conservation, started by Scott Hatch and continued by Shannon Whalen. But what these tagged birds showed us was that during years when there was a lot of food, they could forage near the colony. They did quite well. On years where during the heat wave, when the food appeared to be lacking, they had to forage longer over a broader area. Their feeding sites were not consistent. All this affected their reproductive success. And the impacts of this was felt several years afterwards. They were still foraging far and wide, trying to find food. We're also able, using some of these tags, satellite tags and geolocator tags, to find out where birds go in the winter and how they separate out the habitat. For instance, in this case, tufted puffins and rhinoceros auklets, both actually in the puffin family, forage from Middleton Island in the Gulf of Alaska after breeding, with the rhinoceros auklet going all the way to California. They also put on time depth recorders so that they can record how deep they dive and for how long, and that gives you an idea of how they're separating out the habitat there. So there's a lot of details you can get now from incredible technology. And then we have birds that go even further west, such as red-legged kittiwakes tagged, and here in this case at either the St. George Island or Bull Deer Island. And birds from the same colony tend to go to different areas, all the way over towards Japan and Kamchatka. Early in the winter or the fall, they're pretty well separated, but during the peak of winter, they overlap between Hokkaido and Kamchatka. So this is an important area that we have very little control over, but it's something that we might be concerned about for the future. And then we have short-tailed shearwaters going even further. We now have geolocators put on them by our colleagues in Australia at their breeding site. I'm going to see if I can. There. So these represent birds that are tagged common throughout various years, 75 birds. They breed at the southern tip of Australia. Those lines there show them foraging during their breeding season. It's now November. They go along the Antarctic current. They like to feed on krill and other small fish. Now they're breeding in our winter, their summer. So they're sticking pretty close to the colony off of Tasmania. Getting into December, they're starting to raise their chicks, and they're foraging further and further from the colony. Then they are foraging even further as some of them fail, or perhaps are finished raising their chicks. They follow the Antarctic current even further to the west, sometimes all the way south of Africa. And these are birds that compose about half of the birds we find in the Bering and Chukchi Sea in the summer up here. They do a lot of traveling. Now it's April, they're time to head north. They're going up to Japan and start heading a little bit over to the Aleutians. By May, they're starting to head to the Kamchatka area and the Aleutians, foraging throughout that rich area, all the passes especially. This is where you'll run into them in huge masses, millions of birds. Now it's June, and as July starts, they start moving into the Bering Sea. And as August comes, they move even further north, some of them exploring further. Now they've August, and they're starting to mass throughout the Bering Sea and even going into the Chukchi Sea, both on the Siberian side and on the Alaska side. They're feeding on our rich krill primarily, and then it's time to head back, September, and off they go back to. Well, I'll skip the rest of that, but this is why we need to collaborate internationally, because they depend on the entire Pacific Ocean, and they do depend on Alaska when they come up here during their winter. So other seabirds head west after breeding. Oops, we went backwards. So there are persistent temporal patterns between seabirds and birds, and a lot of the work by John Pyatt and Mayumi Uramitsu have looked at this. They found a lot of correlation. Some species are better for tracking forage fish and other fish abundance. For instance, shearwaters and common murres are good indicators of the variability among pelagic fish. And I could show you dozens of graphics, but I have to move on. And another way to look at these is chick food diet can give you long-term data, such as what we've obtained here at Middleton Island, or at Scott Hatch and Shannon Whelan has. They took an old tower, and I'm sure you've seen this in previous talks, but they took a tower and converted it into an excellent research site on Middleton Island, where they can actually do hands-on work with the birds there. One of the things they've done is maintain a chick diet study, and it shows changes in chick diet over time from 1978 up to the present. And some of these changes that we see have had impacts on growth and productivity of the chicks, and also on stress of the adults. In this case, this is work by Kataisky and others, showing how during the heat wave, they were able to take primary feathers and blood from these birds, the kittiwakes, and measure cortisone levels, which is an indicator of stress. And it shows that the Gulf of Alaska birds, those on Middleton Island, are more stressed out as they've been foraging longer, particularly during the marine heat wave. And this has continued throughout. They're more stressed than the birds on the Pribilos, for instance. And we know birds are stressed when they're dying. We saw this, of course, during the 2015, 2016 common murre die-off in the Gulf of Alaska, where at least 1.2 million, perhaps as much as 3 million birds might have died. And one of the interesting things that some Kataisky's, now Alexis Will's work has shown is that looking at using genetics, they've traced that some of these birds, most of them probably, actually were birds that breed up in the northern Bering Sea. So even though they died in the Gulf of Alaska where they winter, the population that's affected is the one up in the northern Bering Sea. So that's something to consider too. So warmer water, is changing the zooplankton as well. We see that in the chick diets in the northern Bering Sea and St. Lawrence Island, where in the early years, studies done by Adrian Gall and Gay Sheffield Guy, the two species of auklets were quite different in the types of zooplankton they ate. Now it's less so. Their diets have become more similar. The least auklets are depending on more euphausids rather than copepods, because there's not enough fat copepods, and the euphausids they're eating are smaller as well. So all this indicates big changes in the food base of these areas. And of course, there's George Savoky's work looking at long-term changes in the population of black guillemots up there, where as he provided nest sites and there was immigration from the Russian colonies, the population grew. And then it's been declining since, especially after certain climatic tipping points. And all this really seems to link back to Arctic cod, which is tied to the ice edge. And as the birds had to fly further to access the Arctic cod following the ice edge, they did poorly. So what do you do for birds that are not in long-term colonies that you can study, or they move their colonies, or they don't nest in colonies at all? One example is the Aleutian tern, which a whole lot of people and different agencies are now trying to get a handle on by using aerial surveys. And this is from their first year of work in 2023, they were able to survey over 4,600 kilometers. They identified 43 nesting sites, and they found from tag birds that these birds spend their winters in the Philippines, Indonesia, and Singapore. So another area where they might have additional stressors. There's a work being done. I can barely touch on some of these things because there's too much, but when you're dealing with nocturnal burrow nesting birds, there's other issues you have to deal with. And our colleagues in Australia are developing different techniques to actually get a good count on burrows and how successful they are at raising chicks by using a combination of thermal sensors and drones and automated counts. So of course, the Holy Grail is to integrate a lot of this good tagging information, colony data, and at-sea data. And one example of that might be the tufted puffin throughout its range, just from California up to Alaska. Pearson et al. Used 11 data sets over 115 years, looking at trends. And what they found was basically that the tufted puffins are tanking down in California and along British Columbia, less so in the Gulf of Alaska, but increasing off in the Aleutians. So this looks like it might be an indication of good conditions in the Bering Sea and the Aleutians, but at the same time, they might simply be rebounding from the removal of predators that were on the islands, introduced predation. There was a reduction in bycatch, gillnet bycatch in the high seas, so that helped their population. And at the same time, the California current has been going through a period of low productivity, which is probably affecting prey availability. And Dan Cushing's work on the Seward line indicates, however, that tufted puffins aren't doing that great in the Gulf of Alaska, at least not at sea. So do we still need at-sea surveys for birds when we have all these high-tech tools available? And of course, I'm going to say yes. There's a lot of reasons. For one, most of the species, the best population estimate you can get is from at-sea counts because they're at sea most of the time. Some birds don't breed in Alaska, but they're an important part of our avifauna. And in fact, there's probably somewhere around half of the birds do not go to the colonies at all of a given population because they're too young to breed, or conditions are good, or they failed early, and so they don't make the count, so to speak. So if we take that seed data, there's a lot. I want to just mention that there's analytical techniques, some of these developed by like Jim Thorson and applied to fisheries, and now we're applying it to seabirds, the vast analysis, so that we can look at, it fills in the gaps where we have uneven coverage for in time or space. And that's a simple way to explain it. But here I'm looking at seasonal changes in this case, for the Laysan albatross, showing the red shows where they increase and then the blues where they decrease. So we're able to map out seasonal patterns, and more importantly, we can look at, has the seasonal pattern changed with the changes in temperature? And in this case, we separated out the cooler years from 2000 to 2013 to the warmer period after 2014. And in fact, they do. If you look at the lower right-hand corner, there's evidence that for Laysan albatross, the reds mean it's increased more during that period. And what about the climate effect on seasonal patterns of breeding birds that breed here in Alaska? And a relative home body, the thick-billed murre, we did the same thing, and you look at changes between the cooler period and the warmer period. In fact, it was even more so. Thick-billed murres now in April, May use the Bering Sea more than they did in the past. That's the red. In June, July, their breeding period, even when they're breeding, they're more up in the north. And that's indicative of what we saw from the raw data showing birds moving north. perhaps after better food. And of course, in August, September, and even in September. So our Alaska seabirds tracking climate change. And this is part of the same NPRB project. This component is led by Bill Theidemann. And we took the analysts took the isothermal data and looked at shifts over time in Alaska. First, you have to map that out. And that's a massive amount of data, of course. And then we overlaid it with bird data. And I could show you dozens of great maps showing how the birds overlap with what we call velocity of climate change. But we'll just look at this simple Spearman rank correlation, which shows that, yes, some species have a very high correlation with the velocity of climate change heading north. Their northern boundary is shifting north, in particular the murres and the dark shearwaters, and to a less degree the auklets. There's other species, though. If you're looking at the west change east to west, birds moving west, the storm petrels are an excellent indicator of that because they are tracking that change. The murres less so, but so the murres are moving both north and west. The storm petrels are moving west. And some of the other species, not so much of a correlation. So many of these studies are really integrating multiple levels of data collection and analysis, and I barely touched on some of them. I didn't get into stable isotope work much at all, but all of these things are important to give us a picture, to help us look at seabirds and what the picture they give us of the environment and how they might be affected by the environment in the future. So we know marine heat waves have increased. This is work by Jones et al., where he mapped out what are called heat wave events. And on the bottom graph, you see the incidence of seaborne mortality events, large mortality events. So obviously the seabirds are tracking this by their mortality as well. But seabirds are providing signals that link the lower trophic levels, which are changing more rapidly in response to the environmental changes, to long-term ecosystem changes, because seabirds are long-lasting. And we see that not only in their annual reproductive success, but in where they move over time and how their populations change over time. There are things we can do to help seabirds, and one of the success stories is the Naked Island recovery. After the Exxon Valdez oil spill, they were pretty much decimated down to a handful, really a dozen birds. But they were also impacted by mink predation from introduced mink in the 70s and 80s, mainly the 80s and 90s, I guess. And that's the red line down there on the bottom. Through a joint effort to trap the mink on the Naked Island group, the pigeon guillemots are gradually making a comeback. And this is where I started my work with Naked Island pigeon guillemots. I do want to point out that when I was there in ancient history, there were 2,000 pigeon guillemots nesting there. So we have a ways to go, but it is a positive sign. And we can also take some of that at-sea data and with the new computer capabilities, match that up with the shipping data, which is available now online, the satellite-based shipping data, so that we can assess where birds are most at risk, what species are at risk in different areas, and what times of year. And that can help in planning activities as well. And we also have the collaboration internationally, which I think is particularly important for seabirds. Up here in Alaska, we are an Arctic nation because of Alaska. And it's important that we collaborate with our partners in circumpolar polar areas. And that's what we're doing today. Many of you are doing today through different working groups as part of the Arctic Council and as part of the CAF process. That's it for today. If you have questions, glad to.
Thank you, Kathy. Great talk. Do we have some time for questions? If there are some from the audience? Yes.
Hi, Kathy. That was very impressive. I just want to ask, is there any information that air current is possibly affect migratory patterns? Did you get all that? Could you repeat that question?
I'm interested in knowing if migration patterns can be affected by climate change through and through the air.
Yes, that's one of the things we're looking at now. If I think Jody asked if migration patterns will be affected by climate change, and I didn't catch the last part of that.
And air currents.
Through air currents, changes in the air currents. That's a good question. I think people have found that to some degree with albatross, for instance, because they depend on strong winds. And other birds as well, of course, when they migrate long distances, like the shearwaters, they use upper wind currents and such. So it makes sense that they would. We're seeing signals of that in some of the other birds. The other thing that might be happening is with the retreat of ice, some birds depend on that ice to block the wind activity on the oceans. In other words, if there's rough seas, and there's more storms, they have a harder time foraging, even if the food is there. So that could affect migratory patterns as well.
Other questions from the audience? I have one, Kathy. You did a really nice job talking about lots of different data sources. So at sea, colony-based research, tagging-based research, and then some very sophisticated mathematical approaches like VAST and other approaches to integrate that data. And I'm wondering, where do you see the future the next 10 years in terms of both data collection, and are there some new approaches to data collection that might be useful, or are there ways to take some of those existing forms of data collection and refine them or direct them slightly differently to inform some of the model integration that you're talking about at the end there?
How am I going to answer that in a couple of sentences? Certainly there's leaps and bounds happening in terms of analytical techniques and computer capacity to deal with the amounts of data we have. The one example I gave, for instance, of mapping potential risks due to ship activity and where seabirds aggregate at different times of the year, that was not possible years ago, first of all, because the shipping data wasn't available. But even then, the massive amount of data that came in, the Kelly Capsar, who was working on that data, it takes a long time to synthesize that data and know how to do it, and the computer capacity. Same with VAST analysis of seabird distribution. So I think the important thing is, and one thing that we've all been trying to transition to over the last couple decades, really, but increasingly more important, is to have our data in a format where it can be manipulated later as more sophisticated, even more sophisticated techniques and computer capacity evolves. So we have to have the data available, and that's the importance of databases that are well documented and digitized. And yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but obviously it's where science is going, even for the hardcore field sciences like this.
No, that's great. I think the North Pacific Pelagic Database is one of those frameworks.
It was one of the early ones, I think, and yeah.
One more question here.
Kathy, thank you for your presentation. I know your presentation was a compilation of many people's work. Could you comment?
I know your presentation was a compilation of everybody's work that you represented. I'm wondering if you could comment on the topic of international collaboration and any collaborations you specifically have been involved in that you found successful and effective in informing our understanding of Alaska's seabird populations.
Yeah, I think I can't emphasize enough the importance of organizations like the Arctic Council and the Associated Circumpolar Seabird Group, and pulling people together to do that. One of the things, just off the top of my head, we now have the SAMBR, the State of the Arctic Monitoring, I forget what the acronym stands for, but it made all of us sit down and try to standardize what we're reporting, so that we can have a circumpolar look at trends in different types of seabirds or indicator species. And that made me see how important it was that we were speaking the same language, that we were recording the same things in the same way, and that it was put into a usable format so that we could compare across countries. And I think that was not the case before. So that's one of the main things I found by working through CAF and the Circumpolar Seabird Group. More recently, I'm involved in AMAP CAF effort to synthesize the effects of climate change, just do a report, a synthesis of the literature, publications on changes in the Arctic due to climate change. And the particular one that I'm in charge of is migration, how climate change alters migration. And I'm learning a lot just from talking among people internationally on that and sharing information. So that's the biggest thing, I think, is sharing the information.
I think we'll take one final question over here. Okay, George.
Kathy, great talk. And had the mic.
Yes.
Yeah, I went through the same. I went through the same process that you did of going to sea, getting sick, and then realizing that you should go to a seabird colony. But one of the things that you and I had the great advantage of doing over the past 50 years is seeing seabirds from all aspects, from seeing them at sea, from seeing it. And one of the problems now, or one of the issues that's happening now, is that since we did find out a great deal in the last 50 years, grad students coming in now can put a biologger on a bird and then go home for the summer. They don't even have to stay at the colony. They can go back and then find out where the bird was or how it was diving and things like that. And having that whole realm of seabird experiences, I think, is rather important. And having people get out and do that is critical. I'd also like to say that coming out of the Arctic every summer for the past 52 years and being able to stay at Kathy's house and hang out with her and her husband Robert was a major reason why I kept coming back to Alaska.
Yeah. Thank you, John. I think that's, and I think that, thank you, George. And I think that's really important to stress too, is I worry sometimes when I hear about these perhaps methods to count birds from ships with just using a camera and not out there to, I know for myself, when I'm out on a ship, that's when I get my ideas and I really see a picture of what the birds are actually like out there, what they're doing. And I think it's so important to, the same thing at a colony, so important to be there and see it and feel it. But maybe I'm old fashioned. Okay.
Okay, I think we're going to move on. Thank you, Kathy.